Hello, I'm Derek Wheatley, and welcome to episode 185 of the Wheatley podcast. Thank you very much for joining us wherever you're doing so. Thanks, actually, listening last week. I normally say thanks to the guest that came on, but last week was a solo episode where I talked about Sinead O'Connor and the impact she made on my life, and I suppose other people's lives, and the music and I suppose the memories that we'll have. So thanks very much for that. And I'm glad, like some people did, I was worried about not kind of paying enough tribute to her, I guess, her legacy, but people assured me that I was okay. I also want to thank congratulate John, who does my for people will know, who does the podcast with me, does my tech side. He got married last week to Megan, his partner of a long time, eloped over to Las Vegas, told nobody, and got married by Elvis. So that's something nice. So congratulations to them both. You can support us at Buy Me a Coffee, all the usual stuff. But anyway, my guest this week is a professor of English at DCU, Eugene McNulty. How are you doing, Eugene?
Oh, good, Derek. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Oh, you're more than welcome. I'm very happy to have you. I'm very much looking forward to chat about all things literature and the rest. But before we get into that, Eugene, I always start in the same place. Can you give us a short history of your upbringing, please?
I can, and I'll try and keep it short enough. I was born in the early 70s, born in Newry, in the hospital in Newry, and grew up in Warrenpoint. So school in Newry, and so those were kind of my twin towns, as it were. Yeah, look, I now returned to Warrenpoint and realised what a beautiful place it is, just on the shores of Carningford Lough. And I spent most of my childhood, I think, wanting to escape. So I first made a minor enough escape, I suppose. I went to Belfast to do my undergraduate studies, and then over to England, where I spent 11 years within my postgraduate studies in Canterbury, in post-colonial studies. So I did my MA and my PhD there, and I taught there for a little while. And then I was over there for a while, and then returned to Dublin by 2008. Perfect timing, just in time for the crash. But very lucky to get a job back, because I think I actually got one of the last jobs at academia. I started in December in 2008. I'm pretty sure the shutters came down about 2 weeks later. So I had a job. What was then St Patrick's College, which has since incorporated into DCU. So that's really different.
I have this is a tiny history with Newry, right? Very, very small. When I was a kid, my grandparents lived in Dundalk. I mean, my grandfather still does live in Dundalk, but we used to cross over into Newry just to go shopping. Like just to do I was too small to remember what exactly my mom was buying and going to shop at, but I do remember distinctly going to Newry and on a number of occasions. So I don't have a massive history with the north, I suppose, in general,
yeah.
but I have a little one with Newry.
Yeah, well, that would have been quite a regular journey for we used to go to Dundalk for certain. Some people came from Dundalk to Newry for certain things, but we went the other directions for some other things in that kind of whatever way the currency was working out. Yeah, I kind of uncle is long past now, so I can say it. Made his money kind of smuggling stuff across the border, actually. My dad had a great line about me. He said that he made 3 fortunes, but unfortunately he drank 4. So
very, very good. And I'd say he's not the only one who did that. But Eugene, as well, another question that we do always ask at the start. When did you first become aware of mental health?
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting question, which kind of thinking about myself as I was preparing for this there. So I grew up at a time when one of the great changes in my lifetime, not that old, but I'm 50, so I'm kind of old enough, I suppose, but is a kind of an awareness of the language of mental health. So when I was a kid, people were bad with their nerves. And that was the phrase my mum would use. She's bad, or he's bad with nerves, in the same tone of voice that she'd use about somebody from the other community who was the other side of the house, which always had to be kind of slightly whispered, and kind of bad with their nerves was whispered. So in some ways I didn't, and this kind of sounds odd, but in a way, I had my own kind of mental health issues, I would say, in my 20s and 30s. But I didn't really have a language even to know that that was what was going on myself. So, and it kind of, what almost sounds a bit stupid, but really it was about 40 until I had that kind of, that voice in my head to say, actually, you're kind of repeating some patterns here. And I kind of figured out that actually that was what was going on. But because I didn't have a language for it, actually, there's things now I look back, just like things in my 20s, 30s, which could have been resolved much easier, and I shouldn't have got trapped in certain patterns of thought, but I just didn't have a tool to think about it. So it's kind of always been there, but I probably was quite late in life before I figured out in my own head a language to address it, and I kind of realization that could be something that you could address. It wasn't just something you're stuck with, as it were. So, yeah, so kind of always aware as a kind of background issue, I suppose. My childhood, I look back, was kind of marked by a kind of abnormal society, and I kind of now realize that I was surrounded by people who had issues that needed to be addressed. And I say not my family, but just in society in general. Like I've been rewatching Derry Girls, which is a work of genius, really. But there's little details in it, and one of the details which kind of I'm not sure is being discussed. Kind of it's because it's almost as if it's played for comedic effect. You know, it's kind of the shop owner who comes into the shop, the young, it's kind of in his 20s or 30s, and he's just really angry with the girls for what appears to be no reason, and it's kind of played for comedic effect. But actually, my memory of the 70s and 80s in Newry was being surrounded by angry men who were just randomly. I was really kind of vivid memories of just being really scared of just these random outbursts of anger for what seemed to me to be completely random reasons. No rhyme, no reason, just. So obviously, if I could revisit now in a time machine as an adult, I might be able to see what was going on. But at the time, it was just, why is this man just got really, really, really angry out of nowhere? And so there was clearly a lot going on that wasn't being discussed, wasn't being addressed. So it's always been there, I realized. There, but kind of only in my latter years, which probably is quite usual, actually, maybe, or not an unusual story, how develop my own language to kind of address it myself, I suppose.
I think that seems to be, like I said to you, we ask this question obviously to every guest, and it seems to be a pattern of the language and people not having it at the time. And talking to people who are maybe in their 20s, when they were at school and they were in their maybe early teens, they had certain feelings that they didn't know what they were. And then they obviously at that age, you think, well, everybody must be feeling like this, this is just like a natural thing that we do and we have. But it turns out, like you're saying, when they look back, maybe it was anxiety and maybe it was, mild depression, whatever it might have been. And it's interesting now. And it's a good thing, I guess, now that we do have a language and a way to speak about it.
Yeah. And I really admire my students for lots of reasons, actually. But when I sit in seminars with small groups where you get the real discussion going, I think that I kind of look at them in awe at times. Wow. When I was your age, I did not have this language. I did not have this awareness or self-awareness. I just didn't have it. Partly I was maybe an extreme example. My father was at times a very quiet man. Kind of, Seamus Heaney has that line about his father being silent at the point of, it was like they treated speech as an affectation. Like talking was a kind of unnecessary device in life. And my own father at times was similar enough. Maybe so. So maybe I was particular. I really didn't have to for talking about things. But yeah, no, I'm in all the students.
Yeah.
They talk about and what they're prepared to bat around in the room with each other.
Yes.
I just think that it's brilliant.
Absolutely
brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah, it is great. So when you were in school, Eugene, like what were the subjects that you enjoyed in particular?
So I was a confused kid there,
Okay.
as you're probably picking up. So I was probably okay at school, and I was actually good enough at things in the sciences and the maths. But what I really loved was English.
Yeah.
Um, but it took me a while to kind of allow myself that because I came from a family of very practical electricians and all those kind of jobs, and doing something like English and also some bit of an adaptation. But actually, it's when people talk about this, they often talk about the teacher, don't they? I had that teacher,
Mm-hmm.
a man called Sean Hollywood, who is 25 years this year. Actually, it was a major kind of a one-man cultural industry around Newry. The art centre is named after him. He was a teacher, but he was also a political activist back in the early days of the Troubles. Ran a really, really, really powerful amateur dramatic group of players, which is still very much on the go. And it's interesting when I kind of often I hear people talk about the English teacher who was inspiring. It turns out to be this kind of almost Mr. Chips figure.
Mm.
But he wasn't a Mr. Chips figure. He was actually a very complicated man, had his own demons. Was a complicated character. But when he talked about literature, when he talks about theatre, and particularly his teaching in the 1980s, the 80s in particular, there was a lot going on in our immediate environment. Just that sense of actually literature might be a way of thinking about this stuff, might be a way of understanding the complexities of society, politics, economics. It's from him I get my slightly kind of magpie approach to. I think I kind of love English as a discipline because it is in itself a kind of magpie discipline.
Mm-hmm.
So I read something and actually, okay, I think actually to understand this a bit better, maybe I'll read a bit of sociology or anthropology or political science. And I'm not an expert in any of those disciplines, but English allows me as a kind of window to say, okay, well actually, to understand the dynamic of this situation, I can go read a bit of this stuff and I can try and tease it out from all kinds of different directions. So I think he gave me that sense that theatre wasn't just for posh people to go and drink gin and tonic and be posh, which I kind of probably would have thought it was when I was a kid. But actually, it was a place where you might think through things. You might begin to see that actually we're all slightly playing roles, not just when we're on the stage, but when we walk around, talk to our mum and dad, or talk to the person in the shop. We kind of assume different roles. And theatre might be a place where you can, in a curious kind of way, understand reality, because reality in itself might be a kind of performance. So he gave me that interest and that kind of impelled towards further study. But back to my confused child moment, I didn't quite allow myself. So I actually went to university first to study engineering, believe it or not, Derek.
Okay.
So, which is curious, but I didn't last very long because I just realized that it wasn't for me, and I was really doing it because I thought there was an expectation in my family to do something sensible and practical and all of those things. So I started to be a structural engineer at college. Really hated and left and restarted and then went to the here. So I would kind of want to note Sean Hollywood as a major kind of trigger. The other huge influence in my life, a kind of more mature influence in the sense of discipline and career, is I went to Canterbury and started to work with scholar Lynn Innes, who's a major figure, still is a major figure in post-colonial studies. And she was the one who, I suppose, gave me confidence. So I was still a little bit kind of, I'll do an MA and see how that's probably as far as I go. But she was the one who went, no, you've thought of doing a PhD. And I was like, oh, wow, do you think I could do a PhD? Mm-hmm. So it's just one of those moments when somebody just allows you to go, I could do that. So really, I wouldn't be sitting here without influence in my life. And that whole period really Canterbury was, and I'm sure still is, it's well since I've been back, it was just a remarkable place to land. Um, so as well as Lynn, there was like Abdul Razak Gurna, who won the Nobel Prize literature last year.
I'm after losing you there, Eugene. Did it go out? Just the mic, is it?
You hear me now, there?
Oh, I got you back. I got you
Oh,
back.
sorry. Okay, sorry. I just changed sorry, I was probably slightly rambling anyway, there, but I just want to get a
No.
note. Canterbury was just this remarkable place for me and a remarkable influence on. I was just noting that as well as Lynn Innes, Abdul Razak Gurna was there,
Mm-hmm.
who won the Nobel Prize for Literature last year. So I just find myself in the company of these, Abdul Razak Gurna wandering around, being a brilliant lecturer, being somebody I just had chats with over a cup of tea, and
Yeah.
and writing novels of absolute genius. You just okay, wow, this
It's
is
quite the
this is
company.
amusing. Yeah, this is quite amazing. So that was really a place where I thought, okay, maybe I could actually dedicate my life to this world, to English as a discipline.
There was something for me when I was growing up, and I'm guessing I was 14 or 15, and I did like English at the time, and maybe I was a bit wary of Shakespeare and maybe the dry poetry that we were kind of fed at the time. But I remember my teacher, and I mentioned this on an episode before. My teacher read us To Kill a Mockingbird, and from there, I kind of didn't look back when it came to just reading fiction and not, I was going to say serious fiction, but not all serious fiction. But, it was the idea that this was the gateway into something that was going to change me for, I suppose, forever, like to go down that path. Was there any book or authors in particular when you were young that you had that moment?
Yeah, I kind of we didn't have a house full of books by any stretch of my imagination, but there was books floating around, and I remember as a kind of young teen or mid-teen, um, beginning to pick up things. So I read with Thomas Hardy, Graham Greene. I was
Mm-hmm.
actually a fan of Graham Greene, who's somewhat fallen out of favour, but they were my kind of gateway into a kind of seriousness of that literature might allow me to think about things of import, and that you could do things with language that would make you see the world differently, allow you to see the world differently. So yeah, so actually I read loads of Hardy when I was kind of 15, 14, 15. I read loads of Graham Greene, which is an unusual thing to be reading. So there was that kind of moment, I suppose, where literature began to take that kind of seriousness for me. At school, through people like Sean Hollywood, I began to encounter. He was great. He was a great man for Shakespeare, and I must confess, even though I'm a professor of English, I don't particularly. That's not my period that I write on. I still find it slightly something I feel I have to kind of walk my way through, because it's just not my period. But I think I like poetry, Emily Dickinson and people like that. It's just like, wow, words can do that, and like 3 or 4 words in a very short line just make your head swivel round and come back again to a slightly different place. I was like, wow, how do you do that? And I'm still kind of curious about that. I'm still curious about the mechanics of how writers do that, writers of genius. Like at the moment, a writer who I'm kind of really interested in is Shirley Jackson. I started reading Shirley Jackson, and I don't know if you've ever read We've Always Lived in the Castle,
Yeah.
which is one of the weirdest novels I think I've ever read. And I was just reading it thinking, how is she doing this? Because she's just describing something really kind of fairly normal in some ways, in a fairly normal tone of voice, but yet the weirdness is dripping off. I'm being left unsettled here. And yeah, I'm just fascinated by that kind of writer craft, I suppose, and how that happens, and how it's done.
Yeah, I love the what you said there about the poetry, and I would extend it, I suppose, towards songwriters and the idea that they can put in whether poets or songwriters in one verse, and it's like a punch in the gut or something, and you can't quite work out how they managed to do it. This is just one of those things that happened at the weekend. I was listening to the new Blur album, and I thought this song's really good, and I played it to a friend of mine, and I was just blank. She didn't
Oh,
understand
okay.
any, and I was so moved by this like chorus in the song. But I go back to when I was learning about poetry in school. I guess it just wasn't the poetry that I was, going to take on board or interested in. And then we look further afield into different poets, and all of a sudden we're like someone like John Cooper Clarke is of more interest to me than maybe Keats or whoever it is.
Yeah, 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 yeah,
It's
yeah.
just what we are drawn to and what we pick up on, I guess. And Shirley Jackson is another one that's interested me in the last couple of years. I only started reading her stuff, and I read The Lottery, and I was kind of going, after I read it, I was like, you summed it up better, but it's so creepy, but she doesn't do anything with her language. Obviously the
Yeah.
ideas are there, but there's something that's left lingering there. And the power of a writer to be able to do that, I suppose that's why we are interested in English and the written word.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. The other person, just as you were talking about, the other person comes to mind is Raymond Carver.
Mm,
Raymond Carver. He just, it's against that, and I'm really fascinated by it. That like he can just write a couple of sentences where it's like somebody walks into a room,
yeah,
the carpet was brown, and you're just it feels like you're the most brownest carpet that's ever been is being described to you,
yeah,
and yet all he said is the carpet was brown,
yeah.
but somehow you're drawn into this world where it's like it's saturated with this brownness,
Mm.
uh, and yeah, I just love writers and do it.
Yeah, like I did get into Carver a while ago, and it was actually through a film called Shortcuts. That
Oh,
was,
shortcuts, yeah, 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 yeah,
and
yeah.
then I thought, oh, this is actually based on. I know I think it was 8 short stories and a poem, but I was kind of like, oh, cool. I'll read these short stories, and then it obviously led me on to all the other short stories. And like you said, that I have this image in my head of him writing about three people sitting on a couch talking, and one man is smoking a cigarette in the kitchen, and I was like there on the couch. Like I don't know how he did it. He didn't do anything. Look, it's the power. It's incredible. You mentioned already, Eugene, about post-colonial writing. What was it that made you? I know you mentioned it about Canterbury and so forth. What was it that made you start kind of studying that?
Yeah, that's sort of been back a while now, Derek. But I guess um, this is perhaps a slightly cliched answer, but actually it is kind of just the truth, really. Um, I kind of wanted to understand my own. I want to understand the world I'd grown up in a
Mm-hmm.
bit better than I did, and so what I really began to be interested in towards the end of my undergraduate studies was the kind of the politics of literature, if you like. So how politics shape, uh, yeah, the kind of literary imagination, how the literary imagination in turn might help shape how we understand politics, this kind of symbiotic relationship. And so at the time, it was very much of its moment, really. I suppose the late 90s, post-colonial studies was the way into that field, I suppose. Where does literature and politics, where do they meet, and what happens when they meet? Um, as well as all the kind of other that against my slight kind of magpie-ish mind, as well as that sense of it's kind of interesting, kind of something called human geography, so kind of the movement of people and why the person people end up in certain places, what with power dynamics behind those histories of movement. So I just in a very broad sense was kind of interested in those ideas. Postcolonial studies was having a fairly major impact at the time on the study of Irish writing, was kind of the major lenses through which Irish literature was being read. And so I just, in a way, the, the thing that troubled history of the North and my own experience of it revealed to me, or I began to understand further through literature, was that what actually was being revealed there was that was an abnormal moment but actually it was revealing just how, in a sense, how abnormal the idea of society is. There's all of these tensions in. It was just revealing something that's there in lots of places, in the very idea of communities kind of living together and trying to negotiate different things. And that was just a very extreme example where the abnormality of that moment sometimes I think reveals just how complex the idea of the human society is, if you like. So all of those things drew me to well, one part of it, my brain was trying to understand the place that I'd come from, and the other side of it was also kind of wanting to escape that and to try and view it from afar, if you like. So my great mentor, Lynn Ennis, wrote an amazing book where she was really comparing how Irish writers like Yeats with Nigerian writers, and that sense of that at the time was just such an empowering idea to me. Really, like, yeah, I could not only try and understand this place through studying its own kind of writing and the kind of literary imagination that's born out of it, but by kind of flinging myself to very distant places, and then looking back through their experiences and the experiences of writers who come from those locations, and just trying to rub those things up against each other and see what happens. So again, that's a very long-winded answer. Sorry, Jack. That's kind of that's what drove that initial interest.
Yeah, I think I've never obviously sought out post-colonial, writers who are writing about that or novels about it. But we've all come across it, and I think at a certain time period, depending on what country the person is writing in or the people are writing in, there will be kind of a certain amount of books that are going to come out about it, and I think you'll see, like, there'll be maybe some trauma about the writing, and depending where they come from. Do you think that like collectively and individually we can become creative through that trauma? Do you think that's a possibility, or do you think this creation is already there and then the trauma is just something that's added on top of it?
That's yeah. So my colleague here, DCU, Marina Carr, she I was in a meeting with her one time. She just said, well, all literature is trauma. All literature is a response to trauma.
Yeah.
Whether it's of a minor sort or a major sort. So I think in some ways all literature is a response to something, an itch that needs to be scratched. Yeah. The writing out of the North is kind of a particular example of that, and I suppose Irish writing more broadly over the last 2 centuries is an example of that. So I'm not sure I have a particular answer to your question.
Yeah,
Derek, in that sense, I don't know if there's an answer to that. But I think all writing is, or all the literary imagination is driven by conflict.
Yeah,
of some description, whether it's conflict within the self, or a presentation of conflict between different subjectivities, different people. All literature is conflict, I think.
Yeah,
and is a working through, I suppose, what Freud talking about, working through of some form of trauma or other. It's always there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was speaking to a friend the other day about the Irish, I guess, punching above their weight in literature. Do you, like, I'm sure you've had discussions about this with some of your colleagues and that. Why do you think it is that we punch above our weight?
Yeah, I think yeah. I think we probably do. Although I think sometimes I'd also say I think that sometimes gets overplayed. So, interesting critic called Jo Learson. He has this lovely line of the Irish suffer from a kind of auto-exoticism, that we have this capacity to think about ourselves as exotic and interesting and other, and that sometimes that in itself can become a bit of a trope that gets overworked, maybe, because you kind of say, well, we punch above. You talk to somebody from France and they say, but are you taking it like against what are you reading this in a way? But listen, I think there is, if you look at if you look at the history of poetry, for example, in the 20th century, Irish writers are just such a significant part of that story. Joyce at the heart of it. If the 20th century has one great novel, it probably is Ulysses. But of course, my French colleagues might be saying, "Well, you know, that discounts so much else, really." But yeah, listen. I think it's a kind of. I was writing about this recently. There's something interesting in the relationship between Irish writers who are writing in English with the English language, which is driven both by a question of otherness, by a history of being made other, but also a kind of proximity. So, but Brian Freeland, this line around that Irish writers write as if they're always being overheard by an English audience. So this question of kind of that meta awareness always built into the language itself, I think generates something. I think does something interesting with the language itself. So if you look at Joyce's great project, it's really to just take the English language and slightly break it and remake it in a way that gives life to a particular experience. And I think that's born of that capacity within Irish writing is born of a combination of kind of alterity and proximity, which is very, I think, particular to this island and to the history of these islands. I suppose it is a story of the archipelago, of the Atlantic Islands, however we want to describe Britain and Ireland. So that combination of alterity and proximity, I think, is what generates the particular wealth and complexity and energy writing from
you're right, like what you say, because I do think that we play a little bit on the idea of, the rain, and we're brooding, and we're, we're deep thinkers and all that. And when we walk around the streets of our town or city, we can see that we're not really, we're just like everybody else. But I think we do play in it. But I also do think that the people who do stand above, like Joyce and Beckett, people like that, they're so revered in the craft of of writing that we hold them up as like, see, this is what we have. But then we wonder, like, where's the drop, or is there a huge drop to the people down? I know there's still obviously brilliant writers and they're still out there, and we still get nominated for different things like Booker Prizes and all that. But we have these names who won these awards, many years ago, and we can hold these up as kind of like, but we produce these. And like you said, the French will say, well, but what about these? And the English will say, well, we use Shakespeare. So you're right, it's not. I know what you mean. We do have some great names, but we're not unique in that.
Yeah, no, not at all. But listen, but it is. I think it is a heritage to be proud of. To give the other side of that story, but I suppose we should always just be aware of, those figures also in some senses benefited from a particular kind of set of circumstances. So, I'm also very aware that I'm kind of name checking kind of a series of kind of dead white men there. So there's also other narratives to be told here, and other voices to be brought to the table, and kind of an awareness that, well, Beckett is extraordinary, but he was also working in a time when to be a playwright, was that the purview of male voices, really? The history of theatre in the 19th and 20th century, that the theatre seen as kind of the public space, well, then it's kind of the male space, because the female voice is a domestic space, and so all of those things are at play also. But Beckett is also a genius.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So there is that too. So there's that tension in everything.
Talk to me about the theatre as an experience, and why is it so important, I suppose, for you?
So for me, I think it's an opportunity to think about ourselves in collective,
Hmm.
to think about, well, what are the stories that are important to us, and if these are the stories that, in a sense, have been selected over time. Like I often say to my students, like we can go to the theatre now in 2023, and someone will be presenting either a straight version or a kind of a reworked version of Antigone. That's 2,500 years old, that story. So why is it that that story has been passed to communities that have continued to find it fascinating over that length of time? So the story itself and the performance of that story and the relationship between that story being told on stage by actors to a community, an audience is for 2 or 3 hours of an evening, its own little self-enclosed community. What does that tell us about us? What does it tell us about the historic process and the traumas that it's left unresolved? So I'm kind of interested in that dimension. I kind of often talk to my students about. I kind of see I see a play or I see a novel or a poem that's become canonical, so it has become kind of gets taught in universities. I kind of think of it as a kind of a cork that's been popped from the bottle. So for me, my job as somebody who writes about literature is to think about that cork and to think about, well, what were the forces that popped that cork out of the bottle, right? So in a way, looking at the cork, I can backward engineer the forces that pushed it out of the bottle. So that must tell me something interesting about that moment. So if that moment is 2,500 years ago, well, that in itself is fascinating, that I can reverse engineer something of that moment from the cork. And then that history is kind of etched on the cork. So I can kind of study the cork itself and see what particular shape that has taken. But also, I get my students to imagine, well, that cork is, in the case of Antigone, it's 2,500 years in the air. That's a big force. And why has history kept it in the air? Or to take like late 19th century, we think about writers from that moment, whether it's Ibsen or whoever for the theatre, but like there was loads of other plays that were produced in 1894, and they came out of the bottle and just went, blop, and they
Yeah.
just fit right. And somebody might pick up that cork and go, "Oh, isn't this interesting?" But the work of Ibsen or Lillian Hemlin, for example, kind of American playwright, they're still in the air. So what is it that's kept them in the air? So there's something particular about theatre in that regard that I think is interesting, because it's a communal decision still to keep this forth in the air, right? Nobody's forcing somebody to still go see Hamlet. You put on Hamlet, people come to see it. So why is that communal decision still being made? And also I think that there's something interesting about theatre in the sense that it's of its moment. So you see that performance, you see Hamlet in his quandary. So we get to experience that live. But I can go back and see him tomorrow night. He's still in the same quandary, and I can
Yeah.
do it all week if I want. So it's both particular and live, but repeatable. And
Mm.
there's just something kind of interesting about that to me, because I suppose I like to well, to take us back to one of the earlier parts of the conversation, one of the difficulties, I think, I think it's quite common in academics, is that you have a habit of not letting things go. You kind of you want to circle, and that was a very bad pattern of thought for me at times in my 20s and 30s. But it does also play into my academic interest, which is that the interesting thing about a novel is that it can describe a moment, and I can keep going back to that
Yeah.
moment, and I can keep reading it from so many different angles, which in my own personal life is probably a disaster, right? And it's a habit that I had to get out of, but actually it's what I do professionally.
Yeah.
I go see a play and I go, actually, I better go see that again tomorrow because I'm not sure I got a certain thing. So that sense of kind of particular but repeatable is just particularly interesting. Yeah.
I I do that with films a lot. Like I'll watch a film 2 or 3 times, and people don't understand why I watch a film 2 or 3 times, and they'll be like, "Have you seen that before?" And I suppose my fallback is kind of from what you mentioned there about, yeah, but what if I miss something, or you know, even better, I suppose, what if I didn't quite get what the director was trying to say or the writer was trying to say? And I find that in it's like listening to a song and finding something different from it. But I can't explain to the person who's asking me the question really well how and why I do go back and watch these films again. Do you know?
Yeah. No, I
Uh,
get you. I do the same thing myself, and I kind of love it when I've seen a film and then somebody else gives me a different reading of it,
yeah,
and I think, oh man, I did not. I'm a bit of an idiot. I did not get that at
yeah,
all, right? But I love that because then I go
yeah,
back and I rewatch and go, with that set of eyes on me, which I've slightly borrowed from this person,
yeah.
it's now become a slightly different film, and I think that's really interesting, curious.
How are we doing with like I suppose modern playwrights getting into the theaters and stuff? Because I know there's always going to be Hamlet, and there's always going to be the great plays of yesteryear, to use that terrible phrase. But how are we doing with kind of the newer playwrights, do you think?
Yeah, I think we're doing okay
Yeah,
actually. Derek, I don't have a particular worry there. I don't think I think Ireland is um well, certainly living in Dublin.
mm,
I notice a kind of an interest. This is probably quite self-selective, isn't it? I mean, I work in a university and so on, but a kind of an interest in the theatre that's kind of wider, I would say, than other places so I end up having discussions with people from all kinds of walks of life, and they'll say, okay, well, I'm interested in Reeves Carr's new play in the Abbey, and Potter along and see that. And I think we do actually punch above our weight. Now, young playwrights would probably always say there's a problem with kind of opportunities, um, uh, and that's kind of uh, conveyor belt to get to like the Abbey or whatever. But I think that kind of the resistance that's in place there is probably quite useful because to get to that place, it means that you know your work is really excellent. So
yeah.
I think actually we have a really we have a really vibrant theatrical community. We also another thing I noticed when I moved back home from England was just how powerful the amateur dramatic
Right.
scene is in Ireland in ways that I don't think it is in other places. So I think that's that tends to play the canonical stuff rather than new work, as it were. No, I think the theatre scene is kind of vibrant, and yeah, I have worries from new work coming through. I think opportunities are there. Um, yeah, no, I think I'm happy enough.
I'm very bad at doing this to people because I kind of spring it upon them. But can you tell us what's maybe your favorite experience or one of your favorite experiences going to the theater?
Oh, um, I went. Into that. Oh, I know. Probably my most memorable and remarkable was I went to see in Hammersmith, um, Angels in America,
All right.
which is an extraordinary piece of work in many ways. And it takes about 8 hours to play in its totality if you play all the 3 parts. So myself and a friend, it was just the most remarkable day. And I noticed that Druid is doing something similar, going to do something similar. So the Abbey this September, you'll be able to see the Casey trilogy all in one day. So it was
Oh,
a bit like that, except this was
yeah.
one consistent piece of work. But you kind of literally rocked up to the theatre kind of mid morning, and and then you had a break for lunch, and then you went back to the theatre, and then you had a break for dinner, and then you went back to the theatre. And by the end of it, everybody's kind of a bit exhausted, in fairness, but you're in. it's because it's like, that kind of sense of unity of time. It's like you've really experienced this story that's told over this time. There are jumps, but you've literally, in that Begettian way, you've been made to sit through time,
Mm.
and time is kind of one of the major experiences of the play. I think it actually is, and so by the end, you almost made best friends with the people that sit beside you, because how often do you sit for 8 hours with
Yeah,
someone, So yeah, so I think that's one of the most memorable days of the theatre, and it was a day at the theatre. Uh, yeah,
it's it's an incredible piece of work. I haven't had the fortune of seeing it, obviously at play, but I've seen the HBO production of it, and it is. I can only imagine, because not only would it be exhausting to kind of for 8 hours in a theater, I guess, but it's an exhausting piece of work in emotions wise. But
absolutely.
yeah, it's amazing. Like, I know I had your colleague on, Brian, and we talked about his particular experience, his favorite experience at the theater, and it's fascinating to me because you mentioned earlier on about, like, I just, like, you thought it was just posh people going to the theater, and I still have that kind of hang up about it too. And when I hear about what you did there, and what Brian did, maybe, and all the kind of diverse things that are going on in the theater, I think it's just stuck in my head about, like, oh, it's just going to be Hamlet. Not that there's anything wrong with Hamlet. I don't have to go with Shakespeare here.
I hear it's a great play, Derek.
Yeah, I hear it's pretty good. But that idea of, it's not just this kind of stuff that, has been going around for like, hundreds of years. There's a lot of diverse stuff out there, and a lot of brilliant playwrights come through. And it is very important. And like, you living in Dublin, and there's some amazing theatres up there too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. No, listen, I also should. There's also a privilege in that, and
Yeah.
I'm kind of aware of that, right? I was able to do that and call it work, right?
Yeah,
Do
yeah.
you know what I mean? Like, so I was off on the train to London, and I spent the day in the theatre, but that was a perfectly valid thing for me to be doing. So not everybody is as privileged, I suppose, as that. But yeah, no, I definitely, the theatre is the community space, and it's the place where we
Mm.
tell the story of ourselves back to ourselves, and it's always interesting to me when I talk to students about this, in in places where kind of conflict erupts. Uh, Often it's the writers that get rounded up, because the
Yeah.
writers are the dangerous people, because they're kind of giving an alternative voice to an oppressive regime. But of the writers, the really first people that get rounded off are often playwrights,
Yeah.
because playwrights get people together. It's an inherently dangerous situation if you're trying to kind of control the narrative, if you like. So I kind of wonder about it with my students, but I'm kind of pleased to see that I think they still see the theatre as a particular place where we get to tell the story of ourselves back to ourselves live, as it were, and kind of to observe ourselves observing. It's like when you're in the audience, you're like, I'm watching this, but at some level I'm also kind of aware of myself that I'm watching something. So I'm kind of all kinds of
Mm.
people simultaneously, and thinking about the story, and the fact that we're all gathered together to hear it and to see it. Yeah, it strikes me as still such an important space. It does something that Netflix, even if you can have a watch along party on Netflix or whatever, that can't do that.
Yeah, I know what you mean, and do you think that is the draw for your students? The fact that they are obviously some people, are there are people who enjoy or want to understand the human condition, I guess, but it's within reach to them. It's not like through a screen and Netflix and stuff like that, because I know there's a place for all that too. But and I love films and all that. But when there's people in front of them speaking in things that they may or may not understand, is it that, like, that human connection that they find
Yeah,
more interesting?
yeah, I think, and I hope, and I think so, and that sense of, um, what an actor is doing in front of you is really complicated in lots of different ways, And who is this person? And why are they taking on this other voice that's been presented to them by another voice? And and why is it that we're all gathered here to listen to watch somebody who's pretending to be somebody else? This space between the actor and the the role, which either can be completely disguised if you're a Marlon Brando figure, or can be actually presented as a big space if you're Bertolt Brecht, that
Yeah.
sense of kind of alienating the character and the actor. But either way, it's very complicated, and I hope is inviting the students and whoever's in the audience to think about, and I can say to them, think about the complexity of that, and then think about the complexity of when you walk out of the auditorium, and then you turn to your friend, and you talk about it, and then you go home and you talk to it with your partner, or your mum, or your dad, or your sister, or your brother, and the ways in which you might talk about it in slightly different ways and present your own position with regard to it in slightly different ways. In response to this performance, we take on lots of performances, and actually trying to observe ourselves doing that is as interesting as anything.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. So, Brian, sorry, Eugene. Apart from that, what do you? Now, this is probably for you, and I know you're a very busy man, Eugene. So, this question may be null and void, but what do you like to do in your spare time?
So, as I said you over an email at one point, we have an 18-month-old bird, so I have no spare time.
Yeah, that's fair. I could understand that, but I also like, because you mentioned about the magpie, and I guess that's what you're kind of, if you do have any chance, that's what you're looking, if you have an idea in your head, and I can kind of relate to that. If I need to, why don't I understand this piece? Like, should I go and look up some thing on psychology or something to learn it? I guess that's what you do. If you have this little thing in your head.
No, and it's kind of a joyful kind of thing for me, that when it's going well, like there's this term, kind of the erotics of knowledge, which sounds a little bit odd, but actually there's this frisson of just, I don't understand something, I'll read something, and that the reading of that through whatever that person has read in order to write it, I'm looking at their footnotes, and it's just, you're a bit like a detective or something, there's that, it's really joyful.
Yeah.
At times it can be drudgery when you're reading stuff through and going, nope, that's not what I needed. Nope, this isn't doing it for me. But when you hit the vein of an idea and you go, okay, and you're in a very privileged position like me, I get paid to do this. I get paid to go to the library and go, okay, actually, to understand what this person's written, I need to understand this a little bit more, and so on. The problem is there is no end to that chain.
Yeah.
Right? So at some point you have to realize, okay, actually, maybe I should write something myself. But there is, it's when it's going well, it's a lovely process, and I see it as a kind of I kind of see myself as a kind of a bit of a magpie. The Greek philosopher, the idea of the fox or hedgehog, that the fox knows lots of little things and the hedgehog knows one big thing. And in some ways you'd like to think of yourself as a hedgehog, but actually I realize that I am a fox. I do like to kind of go along and figure out these, all kinds, just follow little leads and just figure out where I'm going. And maybe at some stage I turn into a hedgehog.
Yeah, maybe. I think. I mean, I just love Wikipedia for that. Just kind of. It's not as like maybe as heavyweight as some of the stuff you have to figure out or find, but just those things of like, who played the drums on Elvis Costello's first album? Just little things, and you're like, and then you go down the route of like, well, if I know who the drummer is, I better learn who the bass player is, and it kind of goes along those things. But it's enjoyable. But like you said, sometimes you have to remember to reel it in a bit, or else it'll never end.
No. There is a point where you have to declare some kind of stop. Even if you cheat yourself by saying, "I'll come back to this at another point," you never do, because another chain has started. But there is a point where you say, "Okay."
For sure, reverse psychology on yourself. It's good.
Yeah, exactly.
Listen, Eugene, you've been an absolutely fantastic guest. It's been. I can't believe how quick the conversation went. To be honest with you, thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you for having me, Kirk. As I said to you when we were chatting before, I was a little bit nervous because I don't usually chat about myself, but thank you. You made that really easy, and I love that. Thank you.
So you're welcome. Hang on for me there for a minute, Eugene. I'll close this out and I'll get a quick photo for the archives, if you don't mind, and then we'll move on. All right. I also want to say my thank yous, as I always do, once again to John. Although John is on his honeymoon, so I have to do all the work today. So maybe I shouldn't say thank you to John, but I always do. I always thank my mum, my dad, granddad, Ger and Calvin for what they do. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. We're on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and then the podcast platforms, the usual ones: Spotify, Anchor, Apple, Google Podcast. I call that Twitter. It's called X now. It's kind of a weird. It's a very weird. You've got Twitter yourself, Eugene. It's a. Have you got it on your phone? The app.
Oh no! Oh God, no!
It's such a weird. The you know the way like the little square usual app. It's such a weird sign. It looks like it shouldn't be on the phone, but hey, look. Unfortunately, I have it, and we use it sometimes. We don't use it that often. But anyway, thanks very much for everyone who watched and listened today. Because yeah, where would we be without you? It's like we're talking about the theatre there. It's the same thing. And once again, Eugene, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, sorry.
All right, everyone. Yeah, see you next week. Bye.